Okay, I'll just wait to see if people wait for people to show up. Okay, so we're live now. Just waiting, I guess. I love it. I love it too, because it's like it's a terrible rock and a hard place, because if I start now, no one's here to see the start. Okay, there we go. We have 4 people. Okay. Okay, so you are here. We are here. And we're going to be reading one of the seminal books of modern philosophy, Alain Badiou's 1988 landmark text, Being an Event, or Être événement en français. And this here is a Zero Books Capital Comrades special, somewhat confusingly broadcast to a range of diverse groups over Facebook. In fact, we still don't know where we go or where our thoughts are diffused. We're in a state of perplexity about that. And I'm Conrad. You might know me if you've followed some of the streams we do with Zero Books Capital Comrades. And we also have Mari here as well. She only goes by Mari. There's no last name, not even visible in the chat. So, how are you doing, Mari?
I'm trying to stay incognito. Yeah, I'm doing fine. I was actually, I got hit up by an old high school professor to do like a radio show with him on like the subject of identity and how it relates to like the other in terms of like different cultures and like different ideologies. And then if we can loop like anti-vaccination trends and like not believing in COVID into that. And I was like, what's up, dude? Yeah, let's do that shit. So I'm actually
you're becoming a celebrity. I'm just
literally
stuck here like, dwelling in the sort of Marxist media ghetto.
I was like, are you looking at our Badiou? Like
well, that is cool. Okay, well, oh, and by the way, you said about identity. I'm actually writing a piece now for a journal called Identities. So that's on it deals with it's an effort to conceptualize, because you have all these debates about like with trans, like there's women who've been feminists who've been accused of TERFs and have sort of been censored, in the context of pro-trans activism, questions of trans inclusion. And so I try to ask, and a lot of this I think turns on the axis of the question of sort of like what does it mean to be a man or a woman? The sort of sexual identity of women in particular, I think, being a source of contention. And so I try in the article to supply a sort of Marxist answer to that question. And my argument is like, well, in a way, gender, even sex, is constructed, but it's not just constructed sort of socially or just discursively. That doesn't do justice to that process. We have to look at the actual material organization of society and the economy, potentially going back, right? Looking at the exchange of commodities and going back, centuries and centuries, to try to understand that. So I try to supply a Marxist response to the question. But but identity.
Yeah, I mean, it is like a really complex thing. I don't know 100% where I stand on that. I think I absolutely agree with like the whole construction part, but it's not an easy answer. And there's a lot of depth there. But the problem that I have mostly is with like binaries and the need for that. And another problem that I have is with all of this being such a huge problem, right? With like people having to have very like specific views on these things when they don't actually have like a personal experience, or if they're not really affected by it and they have to fit a view, or they have to form a view and fit into a thing. I think I'm more bothered on that, on the fact that like we're forcing these identities on ourselves, and like forming thoughts on identities, when actually, like for me, I'm not sure where I stand on a lot of things, and a lot of things have changed for me in the last few years, right? So yeah, I don't know. It's a different debate. yeah, I want to read more Simone de Beauvoir. I feel like she's a must to be able to even think about those things.
Yeah, and very much like an author who, because I think now you're seeing a lot of, sort of scuffling between, sort of rhetorical scuffling between like, second wave feminists who are more attached to, the notion of sex as like an independent sort of metaphysical vector or way of pursuing critique, and kind of third wave feminists who are more eligible to portray that, as kind of a reification of gender, or sort of a social ossification of an idea of gender, which is ultimately socially constructed. But I think it's interesting with the text like, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, because that's one of those texts that, it's still very much of our moment in the sense that, like basically the people who are more biologistic, they draw arguments from that text, but then also the people who are, more socially constructivist, they will also look to Simone or draw. So it really, it really encompasses, I think, the whole
I think
spectrum of views.
I read it in college, but like, I glanced through it and I didn't really care. And I think back then I was also like always thinking about the sort of like fluidity and continuum and like not fitting into everything. And now I often think about like duality, and like having sort of like representations of both in everyone, depending on situations and flipping and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of like richness to explore there. And I think there's a lot of room to play there. But yeah, anyways, let's do the boring shit instead.
Yeah. Okay. And so we just had a little chat to start. I just want to answer a question someone asked me that's totally unrelated to the book. Why is Justin Murphy doing human trafficking? I assume they're talking about, Cassidy, I assume you're talking about Murphy's proposal to unite overstressed and underpaid, young female social media engineers, for example, in big cities with like, hardy Montana men who are looking for, women to marry amidst this sort of deficit of women who often inhabit rural reaches of America. I would just say, in response to that question, I would say that, as far as trafficking, dubious goods goes, I think that it's a short step from, Justin Murphy trafficking his opinions to trafficking actual people. So that would be my, take on that. But
I'm really happy I don't know any of this.
Yeah, you just got kind of roped into this. Yeah. I mean, Justin Murphy's been trafficking himself, I think, online for some time now, and no one's the better for it. So
I've never heard of this dude. I'm gonna Google him now.
He's just like a transgressive Twitter aesthetic sort of for kind of like a failed leftist, who's identifies with he has certain opinions which are homologous with the alt-right and advances those because it makes people upset, and I think he sort of enjoys lavishing in the attention, right?
Don't we all?
Don't we all? Well, we're here. We enjoy lavishing in attention so much. We're doing Being an Event, right? A book that commands such wide interest amongst the public. So okay, we're doing Alain Badiou's Being an Event, and we're on the sixth part, which I keep flipping to the seventh for some reason. And the sixth part is Quantity and Knowledge, the Discernible or Constructible, Leibniz and Gödel. So the first part of this is Meditation 26, the concept of quantity and the impasse of ontology. And maybe before we get too deep in this chapter, I just want to give people like just a sense of the general theme. I think the main theme that, and this is, amidst all of the various difficulties, right? He talks about mathematics, he talks about Leibniz, he talks about Gödel. I think what this chapter becomes more consumable when you realize that, in a way, it is an expansion of some of what he stated earlier about, the need to posit the void and the problem of like an Aristotelian conception of the universe that's perceived as voidless, right? In which you don't have this element of contingency or change, right? Which he attempts to adumbrate with the use of set theory. You know, in various ways, I think what this chapter deals with, and Badiou considers Leibniz exemplary in the sense, you know, kind of a classic philosopher who developed these very, very, you know, shrewd and quite elegant, quite imaginative schemas, right, as a means of kind of explaining away the possibility of a void, right? Yeah. And so I think, you know, in a way, much of this chapter functions as a defense of his position in that respect, and as a critique of philosophical strategies that are used to preclude the appearance of the void. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I'm also asking for readers. I don't mean to imply that you didn't get.
Yeah, no. I mean, the thing that I was thinking about like today was that, you know, there are like definitely a lot of parts and a lot of chapters where I'm really confident and I'm getting what he's trying to say, but like the overall project, like I'm not sure I'm actually connecting everything in general. But that's fine. I was like, maybe like for like the last, or like if we do like a retro.
Yeah, I mean, your embarrassment can't be as great as mine, because my master's program director was like the world's leading Badiou scholar. So I mean, you know, having worked alongside someone like that, you can only imagine how I feel. You know, sort of just publicly just kind of stumbling through this very dense text. So here we have meditation 26, the concept of quantity and the impasse of ontology. So do you have any thoughts on that chapter you wanted to?
Yeah, so I guess, okay, yeah, we're talking about how to quantify things. More explicitly, we're talking about how to quantify being and whether that's possible. And then, so I think, yeah, is there thus an essential numerosity of being? We're attempting to mathematically think multiple presentation irrespective of time, which is founded by intervention, and space, which is a singular construction relative to certain types of presentation. So then the thing is, like, quantifying being as a multiple, but it's also like an infinite amount of multiples, right? So the obstacle then is about quantifying an infinity, because we have like, I guess like we have, yeah, the form multiple of presentation is generally infinite, but I think it's also that like, I think he would say that the multiple of representation is also infinite, potentially. I don't know if but that's at least how I got it. So then he says at 280, the difficulty is in fact the following: the extensive or quantitative character of presentation supposes that commensurable multiplicities are placed in relation to one another. In order to have the beginnings of knowledge of quantity, one must be able to say that one multiple is larger than another. But what exactly does it mean to say that one infinite multiple is larger than another? So then I think he does, yeah, then I think then we can go into the actual math. How do you compare infinities? So basically in the first one, he talks about, and who was this? Was this Cantor? Yeah. I think it was Cantor. Anyways, someone was like, there's as many square numbers as there are natural numbers. And that's like intuitively weird, because naturals are like, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Squares are then 1, 4, 9, 16. So you have 4 over 16. So how can they be the same? But the point is that you can just map. You have a one-to-one mapping between the two sets. So for each natural number, there exists its square. And basically, a mapping is a function that takes you from one element in one set to exactly one element in another set. It doesn't have to be one-to-one, but a one-to-one mapping is that. Your function is n squared, right? So for number x, you do x squared. And so once you have the one-to-one mapping, then you can say, well, for any, I have a map, which means for all, I have a map, which means no matter how many elements I have in a set, I have at least, or in this case, because it's a one-to-one mapping, that many elements in the other set, which means these are the same of size. So that's basically how you count infinities. You do mappings. Another way that I thought of, which is actually a little bit more intuitive for me. So for instance, if you had like a set of 1 to infinity, and then you had something like 1, 1 to infinity, what you can do is extrapolate the infinite part, and you just sort of like negate it. So as long as you find a common infinity that overlaps, so then there's a one-to-one mapping in the rest, you can take out the first element and you can say, oh, there's one more. So it's really about sort of like a reflection of sets rather than actual counting. So you're not counting when you're counting infinities, you're proving relationships between two infinities, between each element in infinity. You're proving, yeah, like a difference in representation for each, and that's how you count them.
Okay.
So I think that's this whole chapter actually, but let me double check.
Were you referring there to Galileo's comment that, strictly speaking, there were no more square numbers of the form n squared than there were simple numbers?
But I think it was. Yeah, maybe Galileo said that. Yeah, I don't think Kant said that. I guess Galileo said that. Someone figured out how to do this. But yeah, 282. Know that the concept of quantity is thus referred to that of existence, as is appropriate given the ontological vocation of set theory. The mathematical formalization of the general idea of correspondence is a function, so it's a mapping. 283, this manner of use of corresponding function or mapping allows us to replace all the elements in one set with all the elements in another set by substituting one for one each unique. And then at the end, if two multiples are such that there exists a one-to-one correspondence between them, it will be said that they have the same power or that they're extensively the same. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So then we go into natural quantitative correlate of multiple cardinality and cardinals.
Okay.
So
I'm in Rome right now, so there's a lot of cardinals here. Of course, this would be a relatable subject.
Is this fine for you? Is this fine? This is fine, right?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so then I guess the point is that the first infinite set is the set of ordinals, or like that's nature or whatever. I don't remember all of this very well, but the point is that if you have these mappings, there's like a minimal mapping, or there's some sort of like atomic thing. So for instance, you can think like if there's I guess the way I think about it, I just envision like from a 1-to-1 mapping, I envision like a 1-to-2 mapping or a 1-to-3 mapping, or I envision like 3 or 4 sets where I have a 1-to-1 mapping in one, and then in the next one I have a 1-to-2 mapping, and then in the next one I have a 1-to-3 mapping. And so if I look at the last one, I can go back like a tree to that first one where it's a 1-to-1 mapping. So there's something about like a smallest thing. So he says an ordinal is a tool multiple, a potential measuring instrument for the length of any set. So that would be like the most basic thing on the top, the one that sort of has like a one-to-one to everything else. Once it is guaranteed by the axiom of choice, every multiple can be well ordered. Actually, that's not a good sentence for what I'm trying to say. So, okay, by virtue of the ordinal's property of minimality, if there exists an ordinal which is attached to a certain class of multiples according to their size, then there exists the smallest ordinal of this type, in the sense of the series of ordinals. What I mean is that amongst all the ordinals such that a one-to-one correspondence exists between them, there is one of them, unique, which belongs to all the others, or which is a minimal for the property to have such an intrinsic size. This ordinal will evidently be such that it will be impossible for there to exist a one-to-one correspondence between it and an ordinal smaller than it. It will mark, amongst the ordinals, the frontier at which a new order of intrinsic size commences. These ordinals can be perfectly defined. They possess the property of tolerating no one-to-one correspondence with any of the ordinals which precede them. As frontiers of powers, they will be termed cardinals. So a cardinal is an ordinal, and there is no one-to-one correspondence between. So I think what he means is that like there's also no one-to-one correspondence in between a set. So it's not like if you have like a and then a one below, and then you have a one-to-one mapping from the two sets, you can't have a mapping within a set. So it's not you can't like break it down anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, like for instance, the way I think about this is, let's say you have a lot of data that you put in a database, and you want to have a quick lookup. What you would do is you would hash it in some sense, or you would put it in buckets, which means you would have like a prefix or something where, let's say, or like for instance, if I'm looking at addresses on Google Maps, in theory, the database just has all the locations in the world. But really what's useful for me is the ones that are around me, and I want to search for those really quickly. So what I want to do is I want to have some sort of ordering in the database based on like location or city. So where I am, I can be like, this is my shit. And then like I also maybe want to have it according to a street. So I go into the street bucket and then I give me all the street stuff. So you have these sort of like jumps in lookups, and like you go into a bucket and there's a bunch of stuff in the bucket, and then you go into another bucket and there's a bunch of stuff. And so you sort of like, you fold everything into these buckets, but then at some point there's no more folding. It's just unitary things. That is what I would say is the cardinal, which allows you to count, because then everything is going to be just like larger than that, which is the point that he kind of makes later of like everything being at least that or more. And, you know, like building those levels where you keep adding more. So that was sort of like the vision that I had in my head.
Okay.
I said we just go with that.
Okay. So are we on where are we on 3 now? The problem of infinite cardinals, or?
We were on 2.
Okay.
But yeah, now we're going on 3.
Okay, so 3, the problem of infinite cardinals.
So, damn, I didn't underline anything here. I just circled the stuff. So let's just read this. Every finite ordinal is a cardinal. It is quite clear that one cannot establish any one-to-one correspondence between 2 different whole numbers. The world of the finite is therefore arranged in respect to intrinsic size according to the scale of finite ordinal. Blah. This makes sense. So whole numbers being the smallest, I mean, I think it's just because like that's how we count. But basically, the only reason why I would think that the whole numbers aren't the smallest is because you would say, oh, well, like maybe like a half of a number is smaller than, like maybe a half is smaller than 1 and 3/4 is smaller than 1. Or actually it's more when you're counting in, because like if let's say like you have a set of halves, like you have a set where you construct each element in the set by taking the element of another set from whole numbers and dividing it in half. That means that, well, that's a 1-to-1 mapping. But like if you have a set of like 1, 2, 3, 4 and like 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, you actually have double, because you're taking 1 to itself and to its half. And then if you also want to do like quarters or eighths or whatever, you have a function that takes a thing into itself and also into a division of itself, which means you actually have more. So there's nothing less than a 1-to-1 mapping, which means itself. And the thing that we like to have, or like the thing that we like to think of as itself, is like a whole number, because that's a basic thing we use for counting. So they're countables, and then there are more, basically. So
Okay.
that's the minimal. Next, by the same token, without difficulty, one can finally extend the distinction finite, infinite to multiples in general. Previously, it was reserved for natural multiples. A multiple is thus infinite or finite if its quantity is named by a cardinal equal or superior. So if you could, I think this means that like natural numbers are infinite and that's it. But now I think it means if you can take, like if you can have a mapping from a natural number to something else, that means it's infinite too, right? Because you've just replaced everything in a set with everything else. So I think this is like when he says a natural multiple, that's like a thing that's presented and represented, right? But then you can have a thing that's presented but not represented, and represented but not presented, and then like neither. But that means that like you have a thing that's presented and not presented and represented. Then for the other one, you take a function that takes that and makes it itself, but also not represented, or itself, but also not represented, or itself, but negation. So basically, if one of them is infinite, they're all infinite because you can just map them. It is guaranteed that this was the power set. Was this the power set? WO. Okay, I think we just skip this one because I forget the name of this and I'm not getting it from the short sentence. Let me see the next one. Other infinite quantities larger than other infinite quantities. Okay, so this is about now comparing infinities. I guess we were just deducing infinities up until now from one infinity via mapping. So are there infinite quantities larger than other infinite quantities? That is like when I gave the example of like having a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and a 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It will also be a question of mapping for how you like compare infinities. So here he says, are there infinite quantities larger than other infinite quantities? Here we touch upon one of Cantor's major innovations, the infinite proliferation of different infinite quantities. Not only is quantity here numbered by a cardinal pertinent to infinite being, but it distinguishes within the infinite larger and smaller infinite quantities. Also, this is like 5th grade math. Like, I think if I was any better at math, I would have gotten everything he was saying. And he's very bad at explaining the math.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I got much further than 5th grade math actually. So, you know, that's.
The thing is, I don't think I got much further either.
Don't you need to do that for your job or something?
well, half of my I actually I was a math major, and then in the second year I realized that math is shit and it's like bullshit and they're making up shit, and I was like, fuck that. So instead I studied philosophy.
Okay.
But
You wanted people who just unapologetically made up bullshit. Rather than having
exactly. Because I was like, I was in a class and I was like, okay, I get that, like, this has to, like, we base this theorem or proof or whatever on this other thing that we suppose is true. But like at some point when I like go and take this to an end, actually a lot of the things that we hold as truths are there just because if they weren't, nothing would be fucking truth. Like that is not a basis for me. And my prof was like, what do you mean? Like things just have to make sense. That is a basis for knowledge. And I was like, no, like there has to be something outside of the system like that I can tie it to, like a thing to point in the real world. And then we had this whole like debate about like what vector spaces are, and I was like, how am I supposed to fucking imagine like a fifth dimension? Like what am I even talking about? And anyways, but what I wanted to say was that he was like, oh, prove this as an exercise, and I was like, actually I did that in school. So not only is quantity here numbered by a cardinal pertinent to infinite being, but it distinguishes within the infinite larger and smaller infinite quantities. The millenary speculative opposition between the finite, quantitatively varied and innumerable, and the infinite, unquantifiable and unique is succeeded by a uniform scale of quantities, which goes from the empty multiple to, you know what, whatever. But you can do it. You just do it by mapping, right? That's how you prove that something is larger. So then he's like, the state of a situation is quantitatively larger than the situation itself.
Mm-hmm.
So a situation presents one multiples. The state represents parts of compositions of those multiples. So that kind of makes sense to me. Like there's me, and then right, like there is me as a citizen, there is me as a female, there is me as a person who lives in a specific city, there is me as a taxpayer, or there is me as a student, there is me as a person that's insured by the health insurance. So all of these things are just like one more, right? Like it takes me to more things. Representation is always more than the presentation thing, which is just unique. So know that in any case, the state is at least as numerous as the situation. The cardinal of the set of parts of a set cannot be inferior to that of the set. This is so because given any element of a set, its singleton is a part. And since a singleton corresponds to every presented element, there are at least as many parts as elements. So at least I have, like, I guess, that citizenship or something, or myself. So I didn't get the diagonal thing that he was talking about. But I think the way I sort of explained it is good enough. Or no, actually, no. I got it. I reread it. Just let me. Right. So I did get this. So I guess like okay. So the state is, we said before, like a power set, because it's about it's like a set of sets, right? In the sense that like it tries to enumerate all the possibilities of things going in together, where you have the void, or like a single, or like two things join, or three things join, or four things join, blah blah blah, and then you have like the whole thing join, maybe, or that's nature and that doesn't exist, or God or something. But you have these power sets. So basically, what he says is that this is a set of sets. So if you want to determine if a thing is in a set, it's, or like if a thing is in a power set, it's either internal to it, or like, no, if you want to map an element into one of the sets in the power set, it's either going to be in it or it's not going to be in it. So like if there's you, me, and a dog, another thing, that's three things, that's our first set. And then the other set, which is a set of sets, is just me, just you, just the dog, me and the dog, you and the dog, me and you and the dog, and nothing. And so if you want to establish a correspondence between the set where we have me, you, and the dog, and all of these other things, you would basically say, well, either we are in each one of those other things or we are not, in the sense that like I am in the Mari and dog set, but I'm not in the you and dog set. So that's like the external, internal. You either belong to a set or you don't. So then he says, if you're internal, it means, okay, no. So the axiom of separation guarantees the existence of the part composed of all the elements which are external. It corresponds to the property X does not belong to a thing. Or like we have a set of all the external elements. The goal in which the supposed existence of this set is abolished is to show that this element is incapable of being itself either internal or external. If it's internal, so like we're trying to prove the existence of a set of all things which are not included in one of the sets. But if like our correspondence means that we're trying to see if something is in it, like if I'm in it, that's impossible, because if it's a thing of all the things that are not in a thing. But if I'm not in it, that's also impossible, because it's a set of all things that are not in it. And I just said that I'm not in it, which means I should be in it. So it's a contradiction. So there isn't a set of all things which don't exist, or like which aren't included in a set, which basically means, I think, that everything is included. And then there's also the state counts at least one multiple. The state counts at least one multiple, which is not. So I think this is the void. I think this is what it is. Basically, you just also have the void, which is one more thing. So you're larger.
Yeah, and the void's not a fixed concept, right? It refers to a kind of nullity that actually resists any kind of symbolization for that reason, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that
am I
okay.
happy with that? I'm kind of happy with that. I don't think my prof would be happy with that. I have like an intuitive idea. Another thing that is like bigger than it's just, so here's how I would think about this. You have a set of elements, and this isn't the way he explains it, but it's much easier to visualize. You have a set of elements, and then you have a set of elements. If the correspondence is to ask whether each element belongs to a set or not, there are two answers, yes and no. And for every set, there is an answer that is a yes and a no, which means that you have 2 to the n. It's binary. It's like a bit operation. So one is n, the other is 2 to the n, because everything can like either be in it or not be in it, which means you count each thing twice. So you go like 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. right?
Okay.
Because like, for instance, or like a really good example for that, if that's not clear, is in the set where it's just you and the dog. I'm also in that set, in the sense that like I'm not in the set, but there's a mapping for me to that set. It is no, it's a no mapping, which means everything is counted twice. Even if it's not there, you count it, because you need to like say, oh, it's not there.
Yeah, the negativity is like already, or positivity already presupposes negativity. Yeah, that's the thing.
Exactly. So you have a positivity and negativity, which means you have the double amount of elements. That's how I would think about it, in like an intuitive way.
Okay.
First examination of Cantor's theorem, the measuring scale of infinite multiples, or the sequence of alephs.
Where are you looking now? Meditation 26?
5. Yeah, chapter 5.
Okay. Yeah. Meditation 26, is that where you're looking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 290.
Okay, 290, okay.
Oh yeah, dude, I'm going slowly. So since the quantity of the set of parts of a set is superior to that of the set itself, the problem that we raised earlier is solved. There necessarily exists at least one cardinal larger than, I think this is the set of sets, the first infinite cardinal. Oh no, this is just the first infinite cardinal. So this is just the whatever thing we chose to be our first infinite, which is like whole numbers. It is the cardinal which numbers the quantity of the multiple of the sets. Quantitatively, infinity is multiple. I don't remember if I got this one. It's just about something about infinity of infinities.
The set of all cardinals cannot exist. The absolute infinity, the infinity of all intrinsically thinkable infinities, which is said this time, God does not exist.
Yeah, I have that underlined, motherfucker. I'm about to read Spinoza. I fucking hate this shit. So yeah, there's no infinity of infinities. That's chapter 5.
Okay.
I didn't really get the math.
I mean, I wouldn't worry too much. I think the truth is that most people watching this are probably philosophy people, not math people. And for most philosophy
they're
people,
really bored right now.
probably bored, but also maybe impressed, because I know, and it's certainly true of me, if you do math, for most people in philosophy, they look at you like you're doing magic or something. So this may have been why someone implied earlier in the group that you were some kind of associated with like paganism or totemism or something.
Oh, yeah.
Sorcerer like capacity you require when you do math.
Like, do you think I said anything actually complex? And also, do you think that like the last 10 pages couldn't have been written in like 2 sentences with like really easy examples? I think he's going like out of his way to complicate stuff. It's really not easy to like understand. But it's not hard math.
All philosophy, in a sense, can be summarized insofar as it's not, I mean, there's an operational process that's important that you can represent in philosophy, but you can make arguments in all different kinds of ways, right? And people dispute over the importance of that operational process in terms of the degree to which it actually exposes us to, the veracity of the world. I mean, the thing is, like, if you're going to write, like a 500, 600 page philosophy book, you gotta stretch it out. You gotta just enjoy it a little bit.
Fair enough. That's a good point. Yeah, like, and I get that, it's just quantity over quality, man. That's what we're talking about here.
You're like Deleuze wrote all short books, right?
I mean, the thing is, like,
they're more disparate, the contents, let's say. Like each one functions as like a mini.
Exactly, especially for plateaus, right? But like the other ones that I saw, they don't seem that big.
I mean,
I think Bergson is a perfect example of that. Man, like there's not a word of Bergson that I read that I didn't think was like absolutely necessary to understand a thing. and just like said in the least amount of like words in the least confusing way possible for like a majorly complex idea.
Yeah, he was also very famous, right? Because of the fact he was also someone who was just enjoyable to read for a lot of people, right? You know,
and he was actually a mathematician.
Yeah, fairly deep thinker for sure. And very, very, you know, I think still significant to philosophy because Bergson is associated with a certain kind of vitalism, which influences Deleuze, obviously. But in many ways, if you look at the most sort of modish discourses,
Deleuze took almost everything from Bergson. He wasn't like hiding that at all. He loved it.
No. But if you look at kind of like the most modish philosophical discourses today, I would say that, you know, in terms of trying to go beyond linguistic relativism and devise a kind of more realist thought, you know, I think that the fault line which separates people, you know, is, you know, it sort of hinges on the degree to which you think sort of like the plane of immanence or the sort of élan vital of Bergson could be like a valid way of thinking reality, or a non-dualistic way of thinking reality that could be meaningful, or whether you think that's sort of nonsense. And you know, we have to take more seriously these kind of epistemic limitations, to the point, you know, if you take that posture radically of saying maybe phenomenal experience doesn't have any meaning, right? You know, maybe what we experience doesn't have any meaning, and what would the implications of that be for philosophy, right? So you get, you know, again, in some of the more fashionable discourses, you get a kind of, I think, monistic ontology that, or vitalistic ontology, which clashes with a kind of epistemic, you know, nihilism, or in some cases merely sort of inferentialism.
That for sure. But I mean, I think that's fine.
It's good to have arguments.
I mean, I think it's fine to like clash with epistemic nihilism, bro. Like,
is this like an oscillation that goes through your head every day? Like, you know, you wake up, you had a few too many beers, you're just like, okay, that's epistemic nihilism. Then you go for a nice walk in the park, you're feeling better, you're like, okay, now I'm élan vital, vitalism. Okay, yeah.
But there's also this techno DJ girl called the Bergsonist. And it's such a shame because I'm really not a fan of her work. And yeah, she took the name, man. She just took it. She was like, fuck you. I'm taking the name.
I hate it when people symbolically identify with the same stuff as you, but you don't like them. It's always really hard.
Right?
Should we get to 6 though? We got 6 and 7. Then you can, you know,
chill,
slack off a little bit. Yeah. I'm totally happy, like, for you to do as much as this as you want. Like, my thing is like, the more this is like the Mari show, the better. I think it's better for people watching too, because I think they're like, okay, you know, this, you know, telegenic, you know, adult woman. Okay, I want to be engaged with this, but
so like the reason why I'm really energetic and like on top of this shit is because like when we start going into 28, I'm gonna be like, fuck, I didn't get anything. So I just want to I want to offset the embarrassment that's about to come, you know.
Yeah.
So 6. Oh, so okay, if the state is like the power set and it's bigger, how do you measure like how bigger? What is this excess worth? How can it be measured? And we know that it's superior and it comes afterwards in the scale, but where exactly? In the finite, the problem is simple. So that's where he talks about the two set of, is that for a finite thing? I guess that's maybe for a finite thing, like the 2M that I said, being and like being counted and not being counted. So you have the doubly representation of each. But what happens if the set in question is infinite? So basically, actually, we don't know how much bigger it is, but the point is that we can say that it's any amount bigger, because I think that's true at some point. I guess the thing about infinite sets is that like you have like a stopping point where you have to say that something is bigger than something, and this is by how much bigger it is. But then it kind of like goes, that's kind of how I was thinking about it. So basically 293, he says, it's impossible to determine where on the scale of Alephs, the set of parts of an infinite set is situated. To be more precise, it is quite coherent with these ideas to suppose that this place is more or less what everyone has agreed to decide upon. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. The problem is they're unlocalizable upon it. This paradoxical intrication of impossibility and certainty disperses the prospects of any evaluation of the power of the state. That it is necessary in the end to decide upon this power introduces randomness into the heart of what can be said of being. Action receives a warning from ontology that it endeavors in vain when it attempts to precisely calculate the state of the situation in which its resources are disposed. So actually, we don't know how much bigger the power is, or like there is no one concrete answer. Action must make a wager in this matter rather than a calculation, and of this wager it is known, what is called knowledge, that all it can do is oscillate between overestimation and underestimation. The state is solely commensurable.
Like relatable or associable to
the situation by chance. There's a lot like the historical event stuff things, right? Happening. Mallarmé,
Yeah.
was that his name? The roll of the dice. Is that last time?
Mallarmé, is that we're talking about the poem?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a hallucination, this book. I think that chapter was like a hallucination. I think the one in Holderlin was even more in that genre.
Oh yeah. So then that means that Mallarmé was 2 ones ago. Because
Mallarmé was 2 ago because Holderlin was the last one. Yeah.
Wow. But basically, yeah, we just do it, and then that's kind of 7 as well. I'm just gonna read end of 225. Being as pronounceable is unfaithful to itself, to the point that it is no longer possible to deduce the value and infinite extension of the care put into every presentation and the counting as one of its parts. The unmeasure of the state causes an errancy in quantity on the part of the very instance from which we expected precisely the guarantee and fixity of situations. The operator of the banishment of the void, we find it here letting the void reappear at the very... Help me with a word.
Sorry, what is the point here exactly?
No, help me pronounce the word. 295, middle. The operator of the banishment of the void. We find it here letting the void reappear at the very...
Jointure. Yeah, I mean, it's not like that's a common word. Jointure, yeah. It's not like that's a common word. Yeah.
Jointure. Between itself, the capture of parts and the situation. That it is necessary to tolerate the almost complete arbitrariness of a choice. The quantity, the very paradigm of objectivity, leads to pure subjectivity. This is the one point that I liked, because you're choosing how much bigger it is, right? But actually, you're supposed to be counting shit, like you shouldn't be choosing shit. Such is what I would willingly call the Cantor-Gödel-Cohen-Easton symptom. Ontology, which are all the people we just like went through. Ontology unveils in its impasse a point at which thought, unconscious that it is being itself which convokes it therein, has always had to divide itself. I like this. I always like when there's a little bit of a paradox somewhere, a duality. This is the first time I see a fucking duality in this book. The end of objectivity leads us into complete subjectivity. And you can go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the reality is that all philosophy collapses into duality at some point, right? I mean, I think I think if we were talking before about monism as a philosophical strategy, for example, and that is just a matter of making certain sacrifices in terms of epistemic rigor in order to stay above the fray, right? Of collapsing into that too soon. But I think all philosophy reaches that point eventually, which in some ways agrees with Badiou's analysis here. But I think that so just to be clear about this chapter is fairly, or this meditation, if you will. I should stop calling them chapters, I guess. After I keep forgetting that this is apparently a work of early modern philosophy, meditations rather than chapters, like Descartes or something, right?
Yeah.
But
Who the fuck
yeah,
was
so
that?
28 is basically what it discusses is is this 20, no 27, right? Sorry, 27. Basically what it discusses, it frames the history of philosophy as an effort to describe the relationship between belonging and inclusion, or to like sort of make, to account for the non-part, to account for the theme of discontinuity, right? This is how he characterizes the history of philosophy, right? So he says, from Plato to Husserl, passing by the magnificent developments of Hegel's logic, the strictly inexhaustible theme of the dialectic.
It's been an hour. I talked for a fucking hour. Is
You
that
talked for like 50
real?
minutes. Yeah.
Is that fucking real? That's unbelievable.
Don't worry. I'm gonna be quite concise here.
Fuck. I thought it was like 10 minutes. I'm really disappointed. That's so fucking embarrassing. Oh my god.
It was amazing.
Unbelievable.
So framing philosophy and philosophical history as an effort to account for discontinuity, here he outlines a few strategies and relates them to mathematics that are used to account for discontinuity. And I mentioned before that I think there's a great affinity, even though he does formally disagree with Hegel. I think there's a great affinity between Hegel's project and the project of Badiou here. Insofar as Hegel's project was to make the negative, like the engine, of the progression of philosophy, of the progression of history, and really, the content of knowledge or social reality. Maybe even ontological nature, right? If you side with that sort of interpretation of Hegel. And similarly, I think, if you look at the role of the void in Badiou, right, and the kind of ontology he's establishing, I think there's a great similarity there. But so we can talk about the maybe I'll read a little bit from the just the four, so the three, I think, and I believe 4 strategies really he describes toward this, so which he calls endeavors. The first endeavor, which I will term alternatively grammarian or programmatic, holds that the fault at the origin of the unmeasure lies in language. It requires the state to explicitly distinguish between what can be legitimately considered as a part of the situation and what, despite forming groupings in the latter, must nevertheless be held as unformed and unnameable. In short, it is a question of severely restricting the recognizable dignity of inclusion to what a well-made language will allow to be named of it. So here he's criticizing a certain kind of philosophical strategy in which sort of things which are contingent or are sort of non-parts are explained away. And you can see this functioning, this functions in different ways in different kinds of philosophies. We could talk about, the Humean distinction between impressions and ideas, for example. But here he really wants to talk about the way linguistic philosophy does this. More specifically. So Badiou, the critique that he kind of cycles back to throughout the section is that the problem of linguistic philosophy is that it can't actually account for the genesis of language, right? So the problem of linguistic reductionism is it has no means of accounting for the genesis of language. And he basically says, well, if you take the situation, right? If you only define if you reduce everything to the situation, if you say anything beyond the situation doesn't have any reality, it's just sort of illusory, then your philosophy becomes kind of calcified and static. But I mean, it's also just fundamentally tautological as a gesture, right? To take this sort of lexicon of terms that already exists, right, and say that's what reality is, right? And it's like, of course, like, in a way, like if you look at reality, that's what you're going to see, right? Because that's kind of the conceptual nexus that you're in.
I guess what you're trying to say is that like language cannot base its existence and validity in itself. It needs an outside pointer, right? Because it's only it's like a pointee to a thing, and so it needs a thing.
Yeah. There has to be some kind of externality which is defined vis-a-vis language, like, or even to account for the internal transformations of language.
Which makes sense because it's used to like talk about externalities. So
Yeah. Yeah, well,
I
this
don't
is,
know
yeah.
why. I don't know why the linguistic people were like, "Oh, everything is language." I mean, like, really? I remember. I remember we had like a really cool philosophy prof who was actually taught, like, teaching Marxist thought or something like that, for just like a short course. And at one point, he like turned to us and he was like, "What do you guys think about language?" And we were like, "Nothing." And he says, "Interesting." Now I go back to that and I'm like, wise, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think really, if you look at, if you look at, like, language is the big focus of 20th century philosophy, right? So you can see that,
Yeah.
if you look at kind of linguistic structuralism, like Ferdinand de Saussure, if you look at analytical philosophy, like Wittgenstein, if you look at the premium that's assigned to language in Heidegger, if you look at structuralism and post-structuralism, yeah, I mean, I think
I get it. I was really into analytic thought for a while as well, but I think it took too, yeah, it dominated too much. I guess like phenomenology came after analytic thought, or was it at the same time? And
I
the
mean, well,
opposition?
you can go back. I mean, I don't know I'm not like an expert in analytic thought, but like you can go back quite a ways with phenomenology in terms of like early Husserl and like Franz Brentano and people like that. I mean, it kind of depends exactly where you want to define, right? The moment of its commencement. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, a really, really vulgar Marxist interpretation of that would be that it's a response to sort of the disorientation of kind of the experience of advanced modernity, because like I think Frederick Jameson, like, he talks about how when you kind of get into this sort of vertigo of like commercial culture and urbanization, and all of this, and this is characteristic of postmodernity, but remember that postmodernity itself develops on a terrain which is deeply linguistic in character, right? Which has already been developed, right? But when you reach this point, it's like there's no sort of opposition that can be made between like the originary thing, right? And sort of the simulacra, like the artificial thing, right? Because like reality becomes so thoroughly desaturated by kind of like symbols, right, and information, and so thoroughly transformed by human praxis, that we lose this sort of romantic notion of like, well, there's that.
Technology / like virtuality is another maybe like symptomatic thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's symptomatic of it as well. But it's interesting that like in the past 10 years, since roughly the recession of 2007, 2008, philosophy has begun to move away from, maybe it's a bit premature to say, but I think has begun to move away from a linguistically focused disposition, continental philosophy.
I know we started moving away like 1970 something.
Well, no, yeah. Well, you can argue that the seeds of it are already latent, right, at that time. But I mean, I think speculative realism, like 2000.
Like, honestly, I think even the first like symbolic thought started moving away from linguistics quite a lot.
Well, the fact that Deleuze is such a touchstone for like speculative realism itself is already evidence that there were movements in this direction. I mean, like Ian Hamilton Grant has said, like, well, it's ironic that in France we get like the greatest profusion of like linguistically oriented thinkers, but we also get thinkers in France who, and we could talk about Simondon, we could talk about, I mean, very different time ranges. We could talk about Bergson or Simondon, later, like Deleuze, Stiegler, people who are beginning to move away from that, right? So it's, he says France is sort of like the disease and the cure, right, in that way. But I think if you were to look at the last 10 years, and to give this sort of materialist view of it, you would say that, well, you've reached a point where there's a dissonance between sort of these elaborated and self-referential capitalist systems that we've built up, and natural structures themselves, right? Like with things like global warming and also technology, right, in terms of the way that's utilized in the context of like capitalism and the problems that creates with automation and everything. So there's a need for like a re-encounter with the real, right, that is provoked, right, by those conditions, or to emerge from that. Yeah. By the way, we should go on. So the first posture is reduction to language, which, by the way, he analogizes to constructible sets, Gödel's constructible sets, which were refined by Jensen. Any thoughts on that correspondence between constructible sets and the reduction of reality to language? Any thoughts on that?
Wait, sorry.
So don't worry, we can move on. Just take a look at that paragraph with the mathematical comparisons on page 299.
Yeah. 299.
299. So I'll go on. So we had the first reduction to language, right, as one posture toward dealing with discontinuity in philosophical terms. The second endeavor obeys the inverse principle. It holds that the excess of the state is only unthinkable because the discernment of parts is required. What is proposed this time by the deployment of a doctrine of indiscernibles is a demonstration that it is the latter which make up the essential of the field in which the state operates, that any authentic thought must first forge for itself the means to apprehend the indeterminate, the undifferentiated, and the multiply similar. Representation is interrogated on the side of what it numbers, though ever discerning, parts without borders, random conglomerates. It is maintained that what is representative of a situation is not what distinctly belongs to it, but what is evasively included in it. So this is like probably a shot at Deleuze, like the second part, because he's talking about thought which tries to distance itself from like the notions of totality and to develop like an ontological understanding of the world that's based on like a principle of kind of pluralism or plurivocality, right? So that would be. That would,
299 now?
Sorry, I'm reading from 298, but the mathematical analogies are in 299.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Oh, and okay. Actually, I have all of this underlined on 288. Yeah, I got it.
And he compares the second orientation to generic sets, which are created by Cohen. Yeah. The third endeavor searches to fix a stopping point to errancy by the thought of a multiple whose extension is such that it organizes everything which precedes it, and therefore sets the representative multiple in its place, the state bound to a situation. This time, what is at stake is a logic of transcendence. One goes straight to the prodigality of being in infinite presentations. One suspects that the fault of thought lies in its underestimation of this power, by bridling it either via language or by the sole recourse to the undifferentiated. The correct approach is rather to differentiate a gigantic infinity which prescribes a hierarchical disposition in which nothing will be able to err anymore. The effort this time is to contain the unmeasured, not by reinforcing rules and prohibiting the indiscernible, but directly from above, by the conceptual practice of possibly maximal presentations. So I would take this as being like possibly about Hegel, right? In terms of, and so I think Hegel in terms of trying to incorporate discontinuity, right, through what he calls maximal presentations, right? So he says here, search for a stopping point to errancy by the thought of a multiple whose extension is such that it organizes everything which precedes it, right? Which is sort of like the dialectical process, right? In a way, because there's also a principle of retroaction at work within the dialectical process, right? Whereby, the structure of reality is always being understood retrospectively, right? Depending upon, the sort of dialectical state that we're in, right? So it's a way of capturing, this principle of discontinuity or trying to situate it, within this sort of transcendental maximal apparatus. But the classic problem with Hegel, right, like which is sort of the Schellingian critique of Hegel. The classic critique of Hegel is like, well, when Hegel says differentiates being and nothing, right? It's like, is that nothing? Like conceptual nothingness is not the same as like nothingness, like the terminus of consciousness.
Yeah.
So the critique of Hegel is always that it requires this kind of conceptual apparatus in which these terms become encapsulated, but that it loses touch, like that this kind of
with
symmetry.
The actual nothingness.
Yeah, this sort of symmetry between being and thought that's proposed can't actually justify itself, nor, the most difficult step in Hegel is the first step, right? Because like, how do you even make the first step, right, towards positing this sort of structure? Right?
Actually, I'm gonna have the same question in 28, I think. So V299, yeah, I think it's just kind of like a mapping, right? First orientation corresponds to the doctrine of constructible sets. The constructible unfolds the being of configurations of knowledge. The second orientation, the doctrine of generic sets. The generic, with the concept of the indiscernible multiple, renders possible the thought of the being of a truth. And then the correspondence of the third is the doctrine of large cardinals, of what I think we were talking about, to which all the specialists of set theory have contributed. That's the rule we were just talking about. The grand cardinals approximate the virtual being required by theologies. And then we have like Leibniz for first, Rousseau for the generic point. And then classical metaphysics for the third orientation. Even communist eschatology.
It's like messianic, revolution.
Yeah, it will come.
Yeah, someone has to debrief me on the finer points of distinguishing eschatology and teleology. But I guess teleology is merely determinism, whereas eschatology has a more like messianic connotation. Though both certainly have, there's a religious substratum there for sure.
Faith.
You love it.
I love
it. But I'll get on to the fourth way. He describes like a fourth way or a fourth sort of endeavor.
Actually, you're doing 28. You're doing the next meditation.
Yeah, I do 28, then you do 29, I'll do 30.
Yeah.
A fourth way, discernible from Marx onwards, grasped from another perspective in Freud, is transversal to the three others. It holds that the truth of the ontological impasse cannot be seized or thought in immanence to ontology itself, nor to speculative meta-ontology. It assigns the unmeasure of the state to the historical limitation of being, such that, without knowing so, philosophy only reflects it to repeat it. Its hypothesis consists in saying that one can only render justice to injustice from the angle of the event and intervention. So yeah, what he's basically saying here is that, and like, I guess this is sort of like sometimes people talk about the, what do they call them? Like the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? And they talk about this school as sort of consisting of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, right? And the idea is that Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud devise ways of understanding philosophical truth in ways that, they do this in a way that breaks with the traditional methodology of philosophy, right? So Freud, for example, talks about like the three great humiliations of man, right? And the first one was sort of the heliocentric revolution, right? Like the realization that everything's not orbiting around the Earth. Yeah. The second one was Darwin, right? Realizing that we're just like monkey, and so on, so on. Freud characterizes this as being, tremendously embarrassing. And Freud, with typical modesty, Freud's like, and the third great moment is me with the discovery of the subconscious, when we realize that like conscious knowledge is only, the reflection of like primitively repressed sexual urges or, this sort of thing. So it's, and of course with Nietzsche, we have power, which Foucault makes great use of. For Marx, we have, sort of capital, or these kind of terminology has, divisions of division of labor, relations of production, modes of production, and so on. But I do like how as someone who does philosophy and has some knowledge of this, I do like how kind of slippery Badiou is here, because I like how he just, without making really any argument, he just like attributes to Marx, without just saying it says it, without really making much of an argument, he just attributes to Marx and Freud like the same methodology that he's pursuing in the book. And he like Marx, like it's pretty debatable whether, Marx's views on the subject of like the structure of reality, and the nature of contingency and these kind of subjects, right? The degree to which, let's say, he was seeking to distance himself from, Hegel and his thematization of totality and stressing contingency is a subject of great debate, right? I mean, there are ways to make that argument. You can make that argument in different ways. So I think it's nice how he just declares that. He's like, and all these people, they are part of this project that I'm doing as well. Okay. So meditation 28, constructivist thought and the knowledge of being. Okay. I mean, this whole chapter, what this basically zones in, as far as I can tell, it basically zones in on what he describes as the first endeavor to the relation of language.
The language, yeah.
Yeah, and he goes on and on and on. I mean, I don't even know what I would read here, but I did.
Same. That one was actually quite boring and not really, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like, it's quite clear what he's saying, but I have something from maybe.
I mean, but I didn't think like it actually added anything to anything that we were discussing, or like anything that like our project.
So wait, let's look at 302, third paragraph. What is understood here by language? What is at stake, in fact, is a mediation of interiority, complete within the situation. Let's suppose that the presented multiples are only presented inasmuch as they have names, or that being presented and being named are one and the same thing. What's more, we have at our disposal a whole arsenal of properties, or liaison terms, which unequivocally designate that such a named thing maintains with another such a relationship, or possesses such a qualification. Constructivist thought will only recognize as part a grouping of presented multiples which have a property in common, which all maintained a defined relationship to terms of the situation, which are themselves univocally named. Okay, so I mean, that's the thing with the chapter. I didn't know what to say about the chapter because he says the same thing over and over in this chapter.
But the thing is, like, for me, this is like, I remember this from, I think I don't know if it's Bergson or Deleuze, but it's probably Bergson, and I read it in Deleuze or whatever. But like the general, no, it was Bergson. It was Bergson. The general and the particular, and when he talks about memory and how we make memories, and how like the generalities, which are also the named, really take out everything that is special and unique in a thing, and only take out the thing that it has in common with something else, right? Like, there is no white. There is like this white rose and that white snow and this white day and like whatever. And there's this whiteness. But actually, it's just all of these things that we've seen and trying to find something in common with them, and it doesn't really exist. Anyways, yeah, let's go.
Well, I think the best. I think actually I see here that he outlines three instances of what he calls constructivist thought, or this kind of linguistic thought. So maybe it'd be good to review those. In the first case, one considers, this is page 307. In the first case, one considers that the language of an artistic situation, its particular system of marking and articulation, has reached a state of perfection, which is such that, in wanting to modify it or break with it, one would lose the thread of recognizable construction. The neoclassicist considers the modern figures of art as promotions of chaos and the indistinct. He is right insofar as within the evental and interventional passes in art, there is necessary a period of apparent barbarism, of intrinsic valorization of the complexities of disorder, of the rejection of repetition and easily discernible configurations. The deeper meaning of this period has not yet been decided exactly what the operator of a faithful connection is. Okay, so he's just saying like that in art there has to be like these like discontinuous breaks. I mean, I kind of like Badger just because like when you sort of get the general idea of the book, you're just like, okay. And the second, I think he should have devoted this chapter to justifying his claims about his relationship to Marx and Freud, but I'm going to put that aside. In the second case, one considers that the language of positive science is the unique and well-defined, well-made language, and that it has to name the procedures of construction as far as possible in every domain of experience. Positivism considers that presentation is a multiple of factual multiples, whose marking is experimental, and the constructible liaisons grasped by the language of science, which is to say in a precise language discern laws therein. The use of the word law shows to what point positivism renders science a matter of the state. The hunting down of the indistinct thus has two faces. On the one hand, one must confine oneself to controllable facts. The positivist matches up clues and testimonies, experiments and statistics in order to guarantee belongings. On the other hand, one must wash over the transparency of language. Okay, so that's just talking about positivism in general, right? In the third case, one posits that a political proposition necessarily takes the form of a program whose agent of realization is the state. The latter is obviously none other than the state of the politico-historic situation. A program is precisely a procedure for the construction of parts. political parties endeavor to show how such a procedure is compatible with the admitted rules of the language they share. Of measures recommended by so-and-so lies in the... It's perfect. Yeah, so he's drawing an analogy between political reformism and linguistic reduction, because he's saying like linguistic reduction, you know, it blocks us from the void, right, of this principle of contingency, right? It blocks our access to it in the same way that political reformism does, which tries to address all change within the context of like a pre-existing political vernacular.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Rather than this immigration. Yeah.
And there by the way, we have politics, art, and science, right? So, but like I'm just looking through this.
Where are the arts, bro? I haven't seen any of the arts here. I haven't seen any of the love.
He started talking about art. He talked about art movements, like neoclassicism and stuff. So we have art, then we have science, right, with positivism. Then we have politics with his. But where's love? That's my
Where
question.
is love?
Where's love? I think actually I should go back and look at the guidebook I have, because I think the guy who wrote the guidebook said something about its representation here or something, or lack thereof. So on 309, Badia says, in short, the orientation of constructivist thought subsumes the relation to being within the dimension of knowledge. The principle of indiscernibles, which is its central axiom, comes down to the following: that which is not susceptible of being classified within a knowledge is not. Okay, I think we can go on, because I think we're really, you know, repeating the same ideas.
Yeah.
And now we go on to you know, oh boy, should take a minute. Let me make a coffee. We go on to meditation 29, and Mari will take this one.
So I actually didn't. Yeah, like I said, I wasn't that comfortable with this one. Let me just see how much I have. Okay. Nothing there. We're just repeating stuff there. Oh man, actually, I think there was really not much here. So this is kind of like the so okay, wait. So construction of the concept of constructible set. There we basically say that's just terminology until 315, and then we talk about these levels. So when you construct stuff, you have like a level, you constructed some stuff on the level, and then the next level just takes out more stuff of that level and constructs only stuff using that stuff, and so on and so on and so on. You keep adding shit basically. So as you build levels, there's just more shit. The first level is the null level. The any level is basically the level before it, which subsumes all the other levels. It's called the successor. And then I don't know, there's some more stuff. Oh, it's a union, I guess. It's a union of all the levels before it, and then there's like the last level, and that's the limit. And I think that one is the one where you just like decide and you're like, okay, I'm stopping for now. What each level of the constructible hierarchy does is normalize the distance from the void, which is the first level, therefore an increasing complexity. But the only multiples which are admitted into existence are those extracted from the inferior level by means of constructions which can be articulated in the formal language, and not all the parts, including the undifferentiated, the unnameable, and the indeterminate. This is the language. This is the language chapter. Just math on it. And this is, you know, like this is where I said, like when you said the hardest step is the first step. So this is the problem of the language. How do you get from null, from nothing, to like the first thing? It's clear that you get to next thing by just taking everything before it and to choosing the end state. But how do you get from like nothing, which is supposedly your beginning, the void, to any sort of complexity? Then we have the hypothesis of constructability. oh, it's like, can you prove that there's a thing that doesn't exist, like some sets are not? Well, if you've proven that they're not, you actually had to like name them or define them or construct them to prove that they're not, or like have a way of differentiating them from those that they're not, which means they are, or like you have constructed them. So there's nothing that is not constructible. There is no negation in constructability. There is no nothingness kind of a part. Then we have 7 main axioms of set theory. I'm gonna skip that one. Then we talked about, then we have absoluteness. Formula is absolute for the constructible universe if it can be demonstrated that its restriction is equivalent to itself for fixed constructible values of variables. Absoluteness signifies that the formula, once tested within a constructible universe, has the same truth value as its restriction to that universe. If the formula is absolute, its restriction therefore does not restrict its truth. Once one is in a position of immanence to the constructible universe, the absolute is here the equivalence of general truth and restricted truth. Absolute is a predicate of these propositions, which stipulates that their restriction does not affect their truth value. I didn't underline anything here. I don't remember why. I didn't think there was anything here other than, yeah, that pretty much. The decision to solely accept the existence of constructible multiples is that without a risk. No counterexample, as long as one confines oneself to the ideas of the multiple, could be used to ruin its rationality. The hypothesis of an ontology submitted to language of an ontological nominalism is irrefutable. The absolute non-being of the event. Yeah, so I guess, what is the point about the absolute? I'm not 100% sure. Maybe we go back to that at some point. The normalizing effects of this folding of being, of this sovereignty of language, are such that they propose a flattened and correct universe in which access is reduced to the strictest of measures, and in which situations persevere indefinitely in their regulated being. If every multiple is constructible, event is not. Intervention is non-interventional or legal, and unmeasure of the state is exactly measurable. So I guess these are all like absurdities of the language. But yeah, I didn't really get the absoluteness part. Yeah, anyway, let's go on. So the non-being of the event. Yeah. So this is, if you have these levels and you build each next one from the last one, it means that like there's never anything new, right? Like everything just like adds all the stuff that happened before, which means there's no there's no breakage, there's no change in the event or intervention meaning, right? If everything is just addition from the elements before, and like then there's nothing new basically, and the event is something new, it's a breakage, right? It takes the unrepresented to represented, for instance, and stuff like that. It's a change. So the problem is that like you wouldn't know, I think you like, because there's nothing new, if you wanted to point like when an event happened, you wouldn't be able to, because you would be able to trace it like all the way back, or like at the previous level or the previous level. And the point about events is that they're historical, they're like specific positions in time, so you wouldn't be able to like bound it in time in that way. That's like a paradox. The hypothesis of constructability. Oh no, sorry, we already did that. I just took the page by accident. Okay. The legalization of intervention. Sorry, let me just see. Okay, I'm just gonna hold it here. If ontology without the axiom of choice is 323. If ontology without the axiom of choice is coherent, it must also be so with the axiom of choice. Because in the restricted version of ontology, if ontology without the axiom of choice is coherent, it must also be so with the axiom of choice. Because in the restricted version of ontology found in the constructible universe, the axiom of choice is a faithful consequence of other axioms. The inconvenience, however, lies in the hypothesis of constructability solely delivering a necessary and explicit version of choice. As a deductive consequence, this axiom loses everything which made it into the form multiple of intervention: illegality, anonymity, existence without existent. It is no longer anything more than a formula in which one can decipher the total order to which language folds being, and it is allowed that language legislates upon what is admissible as one multiple. So I guess the point of intervention, right, is that like it takes the non-represented to maybe represented, right? It saves you from like the edge of the void. But remember how we were talking about like the event is it like nothing in the event is actually like, or like nothing in the intervention, I forget, like is actually represented. It's kind of anonymous, like the peasant in the revolution or whatever it was. It's awful that I'm saying this in a but you know.
Well, there's
again, illegality, anonymity, existence without existence. So these things aren't really allowed in language. Because everything, again, is counted through these levels, right? It's constructible from something else that came before it. So there is no non-representation allowable, which means we don't really have intervention. Or like it would have to be legal, right? Because it's coming from all the other levels. So there's no like, but that's not how we defined it. So we just don't have access to all of these ideas that we've defined. The normalization of excess. So that's also going to be a proof that access is actually not allowable and that it's like absolutely countable. The impacts of ontology is transformed into a passage by the hypothesis of constructability. Not only is the intrinsic size of the set of parts perfectly fixed, but it is also the smallest possible such size. Nor is the decision required to end the excessive errancy of the state. So how did he do that? Actually, no, I didn't get this one.
Are you talking about scholarly thesis and its limitations?
The 325 stuff?
Oh, 325. Okay, you're talking about normalization of excess. Okay.
I mean, yeah, I didn't get it, but he also didn't go into details about it. But like, at the end he said, Everything comes down to showing that a constructible part appears in the hierarchy before the level, or like in the level before. And like everything that we talked about really lies on that. The fundamental lemma is written in the following manner: for any constructible part, there exists an ordinal such that it belongs both in the previous level and this level. This lemma is what lies beyond the means I wish to employ, but it also requires a very close analysis of the formal language. Under its condition, we obtain the total domination of the state's access, which is expressed through the power set that we talked about before, in the placement in the constructible universe of the set of parts just after it, according to the power defined by the successor. I understand why. So you have a thing, then you have another thing where you add a thing before it, then you have another thing where you add the thing before it, and so on, so on, and so on. So if you have a bunch of stuff, and then you have a bunch of stuff here, but then you have another thing, this is the access. And you know how we were like, oh, we don't know how much the access is because it's infinite, and we can like put a point on it, we just choose it. But actually, we do know what it is because every next level is just a union of all the levels before it. So the access is always known. It's the union of everything before it. That's always the access. So it's always fixed and it's always known at any point. There's no chance. There's nothing to take.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
The last one is scholarly ascesis and its limitations.
I don't have anything underlined here. I mean, a lot of it is retro.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is retro. Okay, I'm just gonna go for the last one. This poverty of knowledge, or this dignity of procedures, because the said poverty can only be seen from the outside and under risky hypotheses, results in the final analysis from its particular law being, besides the discernible, that of decidable. Knowledge excludes ignorance. This tautology is profound. It designates the scholarly ascesis, I don't know this word again, and the universe which corresponds to it is captivated by desire for decision. We have seen how a positive decision was taken concerning the axiom of choice and the continuum hypothesis with the hypothesis of constructability. As Levy says, the axiom of constructability gives such an exact description of what all sets are that one of the most profound open problems in set theory is to find a natural statement of set theory which does not refer directly or indirectly to very large ordinals, and which is neither proved nor refuted by the axiom of constructability. Furthermore, concerning the thorny question of knowing which regular ordinals have or don't have the tree property, the same author notice that if we assume the axiom of constructability, then we know exactly which ordinals have the tree property. It is typical of this axiom to decide questions one way or another. Beyond even the indiscernible, what patient knowledge desires and seeks from the standpoint of a love of exact language, even at the price of verification of being, is that nothing be undecidable. The ethic of knowledge has as its maxim, act and speak such that everything be clearly decidable. There's no ambiguity, there's no change, there's no intervention. The point of all of this. This is the problem with language and constructible shit. Go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. It was great. It's beautiful.
This is the first time we're writing this, and I don't know how I feel about it. Like, I usually like us going back and forth on stuff, but this is fine too.
Well, I think this I think there's probably a structural reason for that, because I think probably this part is quite polarized between like mathematical and
it is really polarized. You're right. Yeah.
So I think normally it would be more, back and forth, but it does very clearly display our respective bona fides, I think, which is kind of fun. This is not too ambiguous today. So here we have meditation 30 on Leibniz, a philosopher who I have to confess I last read, I think about 8 years ago in the third year of my BA or something like that.
I never read him. We had him for a class and I just didn't read him. I was like, I don't want to read this shit. I said no. Yeah, I remember that. I don't know why. I think I would have liked him now.
Well, I think they're very good. Yeah, like these people, like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz. They're very, I don't know about Malebranche, but they're very eloquent, and very, very remarkable philosophers in their own way.
I didn't like the whole.
I guess it's just a banal thing to say because, like, this is why we, they're held in such great renown. Also, what were you saying then?
I didn't like the whole necessity thing. I just thought that it was a very I don't know.
I mean, as someone who probably is closer to like a thinker of necessity than a thinker of contingency, I have to say that I do have great respect for, this is where I sort of go in a slightly different direction than Badiou. But it's important to remember that before you be totally dismissive, do remember that Spinoza was a thinker of totality in this way as well. Right?
Yeah.
So the idea
I think the moment when I allowed myself to allow necessity to enter my ideology is when Bergson made a point that freedom is not about changing a situation, but about being absolutely aware of it. It's about being aware of the necessity of the thing, of acting within oneself in line with things, and so on. And I was like, that was pretty deep, and I was like, okay, so then maybe it's fine. Anyways, go.
I mean, I think I just take like Marxist economic reductionism to a point of resembling this sort of Spinoza's characterization of the universe in terms of, well, if we knew everything, then free will would no longer exist, right? But I take this up in kind of an economic level. But let's get on this, which is perverse for a philosopher, if nothing else. But let's get on this. Let's get on this. Let's get on this stuff. So when Badiou brings up Leibniz, after having discussed what he characterized as constructivism, which is sort of the closure, or the occlusion of the void or contingency within philosophy. And it's kind of interesting because when he talks about constructivism, he assigns a lot of importance to philosophies of language, which do this. We don't normally necessarily think of Leibniz as a philosopher of language in this way, but it just goes to show you that when
is that my dog?
I don't know. It's a dog.
Yeah, it's my dog. Okay. Sorry.
When it goes to show that when Badiou talks about constructivism, that he's not just talking about language or philosophers who are assigned a premium to language or centralize it in their analysis. He's also talking about philosophers who preclude the void in general, right? So in the 20th century, you could talk about linguistic reductivism as being perhaps the main way in which this is expressed. And I think that's the reason why Badiou jousts so much with linguistic reductionism here is because of its significance to modern philosophy specifically. But he gives the example of Leibniz as a kind of forerunner. And why is Leibniz a forerunner? Well, he attributes two things to Leibniz here. The first is the totalization of the principle of non-contradiction. So this principle, which rules the essences, is that of non-contradiction. Everything whose contrary envelopes a contradiction possesses the right to be in the mode of possibility. Being possible is thus subordinate to pure logic, the ideal and transparent language which Leibniz worked on from the age of 20 onwards. So again, his critique here is that, again, getting away from linguistic reductivism, his critique here is that in Leibniz, we already see a kind of logistic reductionism, right? So that he ignores the notion of possibility outside of the confines of logic. Mm-hmm. Right. So again, grammatically, that's functioning in a different way than some of the more contemporary references I think that Badiou was working off before. The second principle concerns being existent, the world, such that amongst the various possible multiple combinations, it has actually been presented. So he's talking here about the principle of sufficient reason. This principle, which rules over the apparent contingency of the there is the principle of sufficient reason. It states that what is presented must be able to be thought according to a suitable reason for its presentation. We can find no true or existing fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is, and thus, and not otherwise. So this is like this is again, you know, not just, you know, relating existence to logic, also simultaneously saying that at any, well, and complementarily, really, saying that anything that must exist, there must be a valid reason for its existence, which, you know, and of course, this is, you know, very famously, you know, Voltaire obscures this in the text Candide, right, where you have the young man going around, and I don't know if you know this, but it's very famous. All these horrible things happen to him, you know, like, I don't know, I don't remember the story exactly, but it's like stuff like his sister's raped, and he has chamber pots dumped on him, and he loses all his money, and he ends up in Spain during the Inquisition or something, and like, and throughout it all, there's a philosopher named Dr. Pangloss who accompanies him, and he famously says, you know, my boy, don't worry, because all is for the best of things in this best of all possible worlds, you know, reassuring him that no matter what happens, right, there must be a kind of rationality. So actually,
but also, like, the thing that I always like to think of it is it's Sartre's, she, like, I don't know where she is, but like she's hanging out on the window, she's about to get married, and she sees like a prostitute on the street, and she just realizes, like, actually I could just totally go down there and like do this stuff as well. Like, nothing is really stopping me right now from like being that person. Kind of an idea. And I was always like, yeah, it's a great fucking example, man. I don't want to be married. Let me just go get some down there. Why not?
I think in a way it's like it responds to a certain problem, which is, you know, a classical problem, which is like, you know, why is there shitty stuff in the world or illogical stuff? You know, if the world is governed by God.
Because it's Spinoza's God, which means that like throughout infinite time, everything will actually happen, including the bad and the good. Well, it's not a good God. It's just an all God.
Yeah, that's a nice explanation. I mean, obviously, any attempt, you know, Spinoza's very, very, you know, pantheist, if you will, you know, and very, very totalistic in terms of how he you know, makes all substance sort of godly. But I think that all directions, you know, all attempts to resolve this lean in the direction of trying to find clever ways of incorporating, you know, negativity or distress into the figure of God, right?
Which is fine.
So
yeah. Not a phenomenology nihilist.
That's, yeah, I mean, you know, well, you know, I mean, obviously it's, you know, this is a classic thing that Christians say. They'll say like, you know, God, why did you do this to me? You know, or like, what is it? This Fiddler on the Roof, right? The Jewish, you know, the guy at the beginning, he wonders why, you know, God required him to be poor to fulfill this kind of cosmic plan. You know, would it make such a difference if I was just rich? You know, could I just be that? But you know, this, but you know, I mean, even if you look at the concept of privation,
I've never heard that before. That's fucking brilliant.
Even if you look at the concept of privation, it's like basically privation is like the idea that, oh, well, you know, if you look at the way that's used by theologians, it's like, well, you know, God is not doing bad, he's not doing evil. It's just that there's a lesser degree of good. Right, which is interesting because it still assigns some kind of negativity to God, right? But you get in all these problems. So of course, in a certain way, Leibniz system can be understood as a very, very elaborate way. And you know, it's interesting to talk about good and rational because it's not really until you get, you know, the yoking together of Greek philosophy with Christianity that you get this tendency to conflate like the good with the rational, which is Platonic, right? Plato's, you know, associates the good with what is, you know, like rational or logical, right?
Yeah, which is completely the opposite for me, right? Like I always think of the good as empathetic. But here I am, a woman. Maybe that's why.
Well, that's more, that's like, you know, you get like feminist care ethics and stuff, and like, you know, a lot of critiques of like logocentrism or phallogocentrism. I mean, that's very common to our era.
But Bergson, man, Bergson was all into that shit, and I was like, thank you. This is the first boy like talking about like subjectivity and empathy and like the importance of these things. When we talk about like ethics, like I cannot believe no one's talking about empathy when we talk about ethics before Bergson. Like it's fucking obscene. Just fucking obscene.
Well, like, so in philosophy, there's been a bit of like a negative, like, you know, I think in the past few years, there's been a bit of a reaction to cultural studies, to, you know, these sort of critiques of rationalism and logic, which have been made. So there's been an effort to reclaim those terms. But I think, you know, you always see this push and pull, whereby in the very act of their reclamation, a lot of their limitations end up being acknowledged, right? You know, and this is very Hegelian in a way too, right? You know, you know, and it's not because you know, like, I mean, I think one common postulate that people take is like a Hegelian rationalism, which is different than, you know, we might imagine like the archetype of a kind of stringent, you know, objectivism or rationalism. You know, this is truth, right? You know, this is logic. That works, right? Whereas you know, Hegel's sort of approach is that, you know, the rational can only be the rational because of its continual convergence with the real, right?
Absolutely.
So if it doesn't have that, if there's not that continual process of,
I mean, to me, like rational is logical is language based, like, or math based. Like even math is absolutely constructionalist. Like what the fuck is Badiou talking about at the end of the day? But like, let's not go there.
Well, we can talk about that. Actually, it might be interesting to do a 9 session at some point just to talk about some of this. But some critiques of Badiou, like those of Adrian Johnson, have focused on what they feel is an overemphasization of you know, the importance of mathematics to ontology. So they don't diverge them, but the need to think in an ontological way. But Johnson, for example, you know, uses Zizek and Lacan and resources like this to try to, you know,
I would love to shit talk about Badiou. Like, man, like,
they're problems, but
do it.
But do remember as well, this is 1988, so philosophy has changed enormously, right? You know, I mean,
you were alive then, weren't you?
I was 89, so this is, you know, the great world historical changes. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Badiou redeems communism by writing "Being an Event."
Nothing ever changes. Nothing ever stays the same.
But so I'm going to go on here a little. So those are I mentioned before about the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. So he says that being qua being is thus submitted to two rules. As essence or possible, one can always examine in a regulated manner its logical coherency. Its necessary truth is such that one must find its reason by analysis, resolving it into simpler ideas and simpler truths until we reach the primitives being tautologies. As existence, it is such that resolution into particular reasons is always possible. The only obstacle is that this resolution continues infinitely. But this is merely a matter for the calculation of series. Presented being infinitely multiple has its ultimate reason in a limit term God, which at the very origin of things practices certain divine mathematics and thus forms the reason, again very Platonic, in the sense of calculation, for the sequence of series of this multiplicity of contingencies. So as essence, it has logical coherency, and as existence, we always find that things are manifested on account of what he characterizes here as a sort of divine mathematics, which doesn't permit this aspect of the void, right? So being in totality is therefore found to be absolutely nameable, he says. And by the way, it's very interesting at this point that he's using Leibniz to discuss sort of linguistic philosophy, because, you know, at the time he wrote this in 1988, like post-structuralism and philosophies like this that had a linguistic reductionist aspect were still associated kind of with you know, being transgressive and challenging to the status quo. So it's also interesting that by associating it with Leibniz, he takes this, you know, very, very philosopher, you know, sort of, you know, religious, very conservative, and he relates them to that. So I think this is also his way of saying, like, you know, I'm the real fucking radical in the room. You know, it's not. It's not Deleuze. It's not you know, Foucault. It's certainly not Derrida. You know, it's me. Right? Though Deleuze is more complex. I should say that Deleuze is harder, and I don't think he was relating Deleuze. A lot of people, you know, the label post-structuralism, people tend to say Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, but Deleuze is different than those, and I think he's putting Deleuze in a different category there. But okay.
I've never read Foucault, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think he just got so popular that his becoming unfashionable was inevitable. But he's good, you know, he's good. He's smart, all smart, good stuff to read, you know. The indiscernible.
Yeah, I heard he was actually a really good, like really eloquent, really good shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very historical, right? Like, to what degree it is philosophy? Like, you know, even like Derrida and Deleuze are much more like philosophers than Foucault is, even, right? Sort of history, sociology.
Yeah, more like sociology kind of stuff. I think it was founded because of him. No, but it's a good, like, it's a good thing to be mindful of.
The vulgar philosophers, with regard to whom Leibniz repeats that they think with incomplete notions, and thus according to an open and badly made language, are mistaken when they believe that there are different things, only because they are two. So he's quoting Leibniz here. So Leibniz says you're mistaken if you think there are different things just because there are two. If two beings are indiscernible, language cannot separate them. Separating itself from reason, whether it be logical or sufficient, this pure two would introduce nothingness into being, because it would be impossible to determine one of the two, remaining indifferent to the other for any thinkable language with respect to its reason for being. So I think this is interesting because he achieves the amazing feat of relating Mao to Leibniz, which is, you know, certainly interesting. You know, because he has this Maoist thing, right? Like the one becomes two, which is.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So he's saying, he's quoting Leibniz here, and he doesn't actually say Mao, but it's obvious he's thinking of Mao too. But he says Leibniz here, criticizing the idea that that there are different things only because there are two, right? So Leibniz is conservative and denies, you know, the one becomes two. So Leibniz, you know, you got to send him to go raise chickens or something in Cultural Revolution exile. You know, he is not a good Maoist for Bao. He is not a good Maoist for Bao. He's not a good Maoist for Bao. Yeah, I meant to say. Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna say this very randomly, but like I talk to my dog a lot here, but I just make these noises. I don't really talk, and the noise that I make is meow. I just say meow, meow. And today I was like, what the fuck? Am I actually just saying meow at my dog? That's really
is that like Serbo-Croatian for meow? Is that what you mean?
No, it's nothing. I just thought it sounded nice. But I think it was probably subconscious Mao shit, man.
So by the way, this is what, and actually Akash Pal is bringing this up. So Badiou critique Deleuze. This quote was used by Badiou to critique Deleuze. Two becomes one. So again, everyone, you know, every philosopher has to be defined on a hierarchy with respect to whether they're on the, you know, the good one becomes two or the bad two becomes one. So he sees, you know, Deleuze as being a reactionary anti-Maoist as well for his commitment to the plane of immanence. So I want to see complete language. Okay, just trying to see if there's anything else here we have to really address. I'm going to maybe go to 340. We've been going for a while now. 340. Let's see. In 340, here again we see a radical constructivist enterprise at grips with the limits of language. Leibniz will have to distinguish difference by figures, which monads are incapable of since they have no parts, from differences by internal qualities and actions. It is the latter alone which allow one to posit that each monad is different from every other one. The metaphysical points are thus both quantitatively void and qualitatively full. If monads were without quality, they would be indiscernible from one another, since they also do not differ in quantity. And since the principle of indiscernibles is the absolute law of any constructivist orientation, monads must be qualitatively indiscernible. This amounts to saying that they are unities of quality, which is to say, in my eyes, pure names. So this is how he relates, you know, and I get, you know, I think what he's saying here is that, you know, if you say that everything is just language, you're getting away from the question of what he refers to as quantity, right? You know, or sort of formal essence, right? So what he's saying is that by making them like the diversity, which is inherent to every monad, by refusing to explain it in terms of actually separated figures, by insisting that these are internal qualities and actions, right? Or by insisting on a kind of qualitative measurement, right? That there's a distance between the notion of you know, an essence which would be foreign, right, to the sort of structure that Leibniz is applying. You know, so if you think of someone reducing everything to language, right, they're like, you know, everything can be accounted for in language. And similarly, we see, well, everything can be accounted for in the monad, right? But you know, if you look at the linguistic, you know, it's a similar kind of thing, but it actually requires that you suspend, right? It's a qualitative, as he says, rather than quantitative distinction, because it requires you to suspend the notion that there's like a formal essence which is external that indexes to.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah.
He says, these points do not halt the infinite regression of the material continuum. They constitute the entire real of that continuum and authorize, by their infinity, it being infinitely divisible. Okay. I'll just read the last paragraph. What we should see in this is the instance of the subject such that constructivist thought meets its limit in being unable to exceed it. A grammatical subject, an interiority which is tautological with respect to the name of itself that it is. A subject required by the absence of the event, by the impossibility of intervention, and ultimately by the system of qualitative atoms. It is difficult to not recognize therein the singleton, such as summon, for example, failing the veritable subject in parliamentary elections. The singleton of which we know that it is not the presented multiple, but its representation by the state. With regards to what is weak and conciliatory in Leibniz's political and moral conclusions, one cannot, all the same, completely absolve the audacity and anticipation of his mathematical and speculative intellectuality. Whatever genius may be manifested in folding the constructible figure of an order, even if this order be of being itself, the subject whose concept is proposed in the end is not the subject, evasive and split, which is capable of wagering the truth. All it can know is the form of its own ego, right? You know, so again, he made an analogy with Freud earlier, right? So with Freud, you have ego, id, and superego, right? You know, and the ego is sort of what like moderates between these extremes, right? It's more of a sort of a quotidian dimension than the others. So he's saying that you know, this whole approach is sort of restricting what's knowable to that domain. But at the same, so he you know, and this is why he identifies with Pascal more, even if Pascal is you know, strongly reactionary in orientation, because Pascal filtered his own or expressed his own you know, faith. You know, he articulated himself theologically in a fashion that still was very conscious of the importance of contingency, right? Which he sees as elided by the works of Leibniz, even when, you know, even if Leibniz is this, you know, very brilliant, right, mercurial.
Yeah.
So it's funny because he actually says of Leibniz what he says a lot of people say to just sort of dismiss in a way Pascal, which is that his intelligence is misapplied, right? And in a way, he's not willing to say this of Pascal, but he is willing to say it of Leibniz. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it fits better into his schema.
Okay, so that's been 2 hours and 4 minutes. My God, that's it. I gotta head out like right
Also,
now.
it's like 11 p.m. here. I'm so fucking tired.
It's 11. It's 11 here too. Actually, I guess we're in the same time right now.
Yeah, we're in the same time.
I gotta run right now. But I'll see you next week then.
Yeah.
Okay, and really great work today. Thanks for those who listened. So next week, on the 15th, December 15th, we're trying to finish this all by Christmas. On December 15th, Mari and I will be doing part 7 of Being an Event, the generic, indiscernible in truth, the event, PJ Cohen. So if you'd like to read part 7 with us and tune in next week, that'd be cool. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you, Mari, and I'll see everyone next week.
Thank you. Bye.